On February 18, 2011, deep in the Arabian Sea, far from any coastline or quick avenue of rescue, the American yacht SY Quest sailed steadily across waters that had long been recognized as among the most dangerous in the world. The vessel, a 58-foot sailing yacht intended for peaceful voyages and missionary work rather than for war, carried 4 Americans who had dedicated their lives to the sea and to their faith. Scott and Jane Adam, experienced sailors from California, were joined by Phyllis McKay and Robert Riggle from Seattle, and together they had chosen a path of exploration and service that brought them into an oceanic corridor increasingly stalked by Somali pirate groups. These pirates, no longer confined to the shallow waters near their homeland, had extended their reach hundreds of miles offshore, using captured fishing vessels as mobile bases to project violence deep into international lanes of commerce. Without warning, the calm horizon fractured when a mother ship released fast attack skiffs bristling with weapons. The sharp roar of outboard engines shattered the stillness of the sea as armed men surged forward, each boat carrying pirates wielding assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Against such force, the SY Quest had no chance of escape, its sails no match for engines and its unarmed crew defenseless against hardened raiders. Within moments, the yacht was surrounded, cut off from every course, its deck overrun as shouting attackers seized control. The Americans were forced below, their world transformed in an instant from a voyage of faith and discovery into a prison adrift on the ocean. What followed was not merely an isolated crime at sea, but an episode that drew the attention of the most powerful navy on Earth. The United States could not ignore 4 of its citizens held at gunpoint in a theater where piracy had already destabilized global shipping. As warships raced to intercept and encircled the captured yacht, the stage was set for a confrontation between desperate gunmen and overwhelming naval power. A confrontation in which every second carried the weight of 4 lives, and whose outcome would test not only tactics, but the very limits of maritime rescue itself. On February 18, 2011, the American yacht SY Quest sailed quietly through the Arabian Sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest shore. The vessel was small compared to the cargo ships and tankers that normally dominated these waters, a 58-foot sailing yacht designed for leisure rather than endurance against hostile forces. On board were 4 Americans, Scott and Jane Adam, experienced sailors from California who had dedicated much of their lives to maritime missionary work, and their companions Phyllis McKay and Robert Riggle, travelers from Seattle. They had crossed vast distances before, guided by the rhythm of the wind and the certainty of their charts. But this voyage placed them in one of the most dangerous maritime zones in the world. The Gulf of Aden and the northern Arabian Sea had become the hunting ground of Somali pirates who pushed their reach farther every year, no longer confined to coastal waters, but striking deep into international shipping lanes. The attack came without warning. A mother ship, itself likely a hijacked fishing vessel, had carried a team of 19 armed men far from Somalia's coast. From its deck, fast skiffs launched into the open sea, their engines cutting across the still water with a high-pitched roar. These boats were light, maneuverable, and designed for speed, closing distances that larger ships could not hope to escape. Each carried men armed with AK-47 rifles and at least 1 RPG-7 launcher, weapons intended not only to overpower resistance, but also to instill immediate terror. For a vessel like the SY Quest, with no defensive weapons and a civilian crew, there was no chance of outrunning or resisting the assault. The pirates surrounded the yacht, circling in patterns that left no room for maneuver. Shouts rang out, weapons were raised, and within minutes, the attackers had boarded. The Americans were helpless, forced to surrender as the armed men seized control of the vessel. Once on board, the pirates consolidated their power swiftly. They divided themselves between guard positions, some stationed visibly with rifles trained on the hostages, others controlling navigation and steering the yacht westward. The tactic was clear: to bring the vessel into deeper waters and prepare it either for ransom negotiations or for use as a bargaining chip against Western powers. The 4 hostages were ordered below deck, their movements restricted, every moment under the threat of sudden violence. For them, the hijacking was not only a moment of fear, but also the beginning of a grim uncertainty. They knew that piracy in this region had grown increasingly violent. that ransoms had risen, and that captives were often mistreated or killed when negotiations faltered. The sea that had once been a place of freedom now became a cage. The yacht's isolation meant that any rescue attempt would depend on warships stationed far away, forced to steam at full speed to intercept. Radio silence was imposed by the pirates, and the hostages had no way to signal distress beyond what was already suspected by naval patrols in the region. As the sun lowered over the Arabian Sea, the SY quest was no longer a symbol of adventure, but a pawn in a dangerous confrontation. The pirates had the initiative, the weapons, and the time. The only question was whether the approaching naval power of the United States could intervene before the hostages paid the ultimate price. The sea was calm, the horizon wide, and the clock had already started ticking against them. When news of the hijacking reached U.S. Naval Command, the reaction was immediate. The capture of American citizens in the Arabian Sea was not an isolated case, but part of a broader surge of Somali piracy that had already disrupted global shipping lanes and placed international crews in constant danger. This time, however, 4 American lives were at stake, and the United States Navy was determined to act with decisive force. The order went out to mobilize a carrier strike group already present in the region. At the heart of that formation was the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, one of the most formidable symbols of American sea power. Alongside her were the guided missile cruiser USS Lady Gulf and the destroyers USS Sterett and USS Bulkley. Together, they represented a concentrated package of surveillance, air power, missile defense, and special operations capability, all now converging on the position of a single hijacked yacht. The response was more than symbolic. Carrier air wings brought the ability to maintain constant patrols over the ocean, ensuring that no movement by the pirates could go unnoticed. The Aegis combat systems aboard the cruiser and destroyers allowed precise tracking of surface contacts and provided radar coverage across hundreds of miles, narrowing the search for the SY quest. Intelligence aircraft and helicopters extended the eyes of the fleet even further, covering the broad swath of ocean where the yacht had been taken. Teams of Navy SEALs and specialized boarding units prepared for the possibility of forced entry should negotiations collapse. Secure communications linked the ships not only to each other, but to commanders ashore, ensuring that every decision was coordinated and every move weighed against the risks to the hostages. As the warships closed the gap, the isolation of the SY quest began to diminish, but the danger to its passengers remained painfully real. The pirates were armed and unpredictable, and their tactics had grown increasingly violent in recent years. By February 21st, the U.S. task force had encircled the hijacked yacht at a safe distance, careful not to provoke sudden violence. The USS Sterett, a destroyer equipped with both missile defense systems and close-in weapons for last resort protection, became the primary contact ship for negotiations. Its crew established secure channels with the pirates, attempting to begin dialogue through interpreters while keeping weapons trained and helicopters airborne overhead. For a moment, there was hope. The presence of overwhelming naval power seemed to offer a chance to stabilize the situation and persuade the pirates to surrender without bloodshed. Yet the sea is rarely predictable, and the tension of armed men trapped in a corner can twist any negotiation into chaos. Every sailor aboard the task force ships understood that even the strongest fleet cannot guarantee the safe return of hostages once guns are already in the hands of desperate captors. The Americans on board the yacht were alive, but their fate depended on the fragile line of conversation carried across the water. The world's most powerful navy had arrived, yet events were already sliding toward a confrontation that no amount of steel or firepower could fully control. By the morning of February 21st, the USS Sterett had established its position as the central point of contact with the hijacked yacht. The destroyer maintained a cautious distance, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid provoking immediate violence. Overhead, helicopters from the carrier strike group circled in wide arcs, their rotors echoing across the calm sea, reminding everyone that overwhelming force was in the area. On the horizon, the vast silhouette of the USS Enterprise loomed, her flight deck bristling with aircraft ready to respond at a moment's notice. The American naval force had created an iron ring around the SY quest, But the real challenge was not military. The pirates still held 4 hostages, and the next move would be decided through words, not missiles. The negotiations began with great difficulty. Communications officers aboard the Sterret opened secure channels, and translators relayed messages to the pirates in their native Somali dialects. Captain D. Mewborn, commanding officer of the destroyer, oversaw the process personally, aware that each phrase carried the weight of 4 lives. The pirates demanded recognition, ransom, and above all, a demonstration that they could bargain on equal footing with a superpower. For the American side, the instructions were clear. The rules of engagement required every attempt at peaceful resolution before lethal force could be considered. The conversations were tense and uneven, with long pauses punctuated by bursts of shouting from the hijacked yacht. The Navy sought to calm the situation, offering assurances that the hostages would be safe if the pirates surrendered. The pirates, however, were fueled by mistrust and the constant fear that an assault team could strike at any second. The distance across the water became a stage for fear and calculation, each side trying to measure how far the other would go. For hours, the dialogue continued with no breakthrough. The crew of the Sterret remained at battle stations, sensors locked on the yacht, weapons systems on silent standby. Every sailor knew that the fragile chain of words could snap with the slightest provocation. The sea was deceptively calm, reflecting sunlight, as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Yet within that stillness, men with rifles and rocket launchers paced the deck of the SY Quest. The hostages remained unseen, their voices absent from the exchange, their fate sealed within the decisions of others. Tension aboard the U.S. warships grew heavier with each hour of stalemate. The Navy had succeeded in surrounding the pirates, cutting off escape, but had not succeeded in persuading them to yield. Hope flickered when interpreters reported signs of uncertainty among some of the pirates, suggesting that internal divisions might exist. Yet just as that possibility began to emerge, a single act would destroy the fragile balance. A weapon would be raised, a trigger pulled, and the sound that followed would echo across the sea, shattering the negotiations in an instant. The tension that had built during the long negotiations finally broke on February 22nd, when a sudden act of violence shattered the fragile balance. From the deck of the hijacked SY Quest, a pirate shouldered an RPG-7 launcher and aimed it across the water at the USS Sterret. The destroyer was not within close range, but was clearly visible, a looming presence that had watched the yacht with constant vigilance. The rocket-propelled grenade was never a precision weapon, and against the armor and distance of a warship, it posed little real threat. Yet the act itself was far more dangerous than the warhead it carried. The launch announced that the pirates were willing to escalate, that the negotiations were collapsing, and that the lives of the 4 hostages were now in greater peril than ever. The flash of ignition and the streak of smoke across the sea marked a point of no return. The RPG-7 was a weapon designed in the Cold War, simple and rugged, firing a rocket-propelled grenade capable of penetrating armored vehicles at close range. In the hands of Somali pirates, it was a tool of intimidation, its effectiveness not in sinking ships, but in forcing hesitation. The projectile arced across the waves, trailing smoke, before losing momentum and falling harmlessly into the sea, short of the destroyer. On the bridge of the Sterret, officers tracked the launch on sensors and visually confirmed the trajectory. No alarm was sounded about damage because none was possible at that distance. Instead, the meaning of the act became clear. The pirates had chosen to fire not as a tactical strike, but as a symbolic gesture. It was a warning that they would not be coerced, that they were willing to risk destruction rather than surrender. For the Navy, it was confirmation that dialogue was slipping beyond reach, and that every passing second increased the likelihood of bloodshed on board the yacht. What followed was silence, broken only by the sound of the sea and the low hum of engines. Then, through communications channels and intercepted signals, it became apparent that panic had spread among the pirates. The stress of days surrounded by overwhelming force, the fatigue of holding weapons in constant readiness, and the fear of betrayal within their own ranks began to unravel their control. Some shouted among themselves, others moved erratically across the deck, and the tension within the confined space of the yacht grew unbearable. Suddenly, the Navy's listening teams detected bursts of automatic gunfire from within the vessel. The sounds were not warning shots into the air. They came from inside the compartments where the hostages were held. In that moment, the crisis crossed the final threshold. The RPG shot had been the warning sign of collapse. The gunfire was its confirmation. Aboard, the Sterett commanders and crew understood that time had run out. The next move would have to be made with speed and violence, because every second of hesitation meant the hostages were closer to execution. The sea that had carried days of waiting and fragile words now carried the sharp echo of gunfire, and the world's strongest navy was forced into action. The moment the sound of gunfire reached the USS Sterett, the decision was made that words had failed and force was now the only option. Commanders knew that every second wasted could mean the death of the hostages already trapped inside the yacht. Orders were transmitted swiftly across the task force, and boarding teams were deployed. Small boats were lowered into the sea, carrying U.S. Navy sailors trained for close-quarters combat. Men who had rehearsed this scenario countless times, but who understood that no rehearsal could prepare them fully for the chaos of reality. As the boats closed the distance to the SY quest, the roar of engines echoed across the water, blending with the hum of helicopters circling above to provide cover. The sea remained deceptively calm, but every man approaching knew that what awaited inside the yacht would be anything but calm. The boarding teams used grappling equipment to climb swiftly onto the vessel, securing the deck under the threat of immediate fire. Resistance was encountered almost at once. Pirates opened fire from narrow passages, their weapons unleashing bursts that forced the sailors to return fire in confined quarters. The yacht was never designed for combat, and its tight interiors turned every movement into a struggle. Grenades and rockets were useless in such close spaces, leaving rifles and sidearms as the weapons of survival. The Americans advanced compartment by compartment, using shields, flashlights, and precision tactics to overwhelm the defenders. 2 pirates were killed in the violent exchanges that erupted below deck. Others, realizing the futility of fighting against disciplined and heavily armed boarding teams, surrendered once their weapons were turned against them. The clash was brief but brutal, the sounds of boots on steel, the crack of rifles, and the shouts of orders filling the yacht until the gunfire finally ceased. When the fighting subsided, the sailors discovered the full extent of the tragedy. All 4 hostages had been shot during the chaos that preceded the assault. Despite desperate medical efforts by Navy medics who rushed aboard with the boarding parties, the Americans were pronounced dead. The rescue had come too late to save them. 13 pirates were taken into custody, their weapons seized, and their capture a small measure of accountability in a sea filled with grief. For the sailors who had risked everything to storm the yacht, there was no sense of triumph, only the heavy weight of failure in the face of impossible circumstances. The bodies of the 4 Americans were carried carefully to the waiting boats, draped and secured for transfer to the task force ships. Above, the helicopters continued to circle, engines steady, as if marking the solemn end of the battle. The mission had neutralized the threat, but the cost had been irreversible. For every sailor watching the horizon that evening, one thought lingered. The fight was over, but the enemy was not just the pirates. The enemy was also the merciless speed of events that had denied the world's strongest navy the chance to save 4 innocent lives. When the guns fell silent aboard the hijacked yacht and the bodies of the 4 Americans were secured for transfer, the focus of the U.S. Navy shifted from combat to custody. 13 pirates had survived the boarding operation, and they were now prisoners of war in everything but name. Bound and guarded, they were transferred from the blood-stained yacht to the steel decks of American warships. The atmosphere on board the USS Sterett was somber, with sailors carrying both the weight of loss and the grim satisfaction of removing dangerous men from the seas. The deaths of the hostages overshadowed any sense of achievement, yet the capture of the surviving pirates ensured that accountability would not vanish into the waves. The sea had been the battlefield, but the next chapter would unfold in a courtroom thousands of miles away. The United States made the decision to prosecute the pirates under its own federal system. In March 2011, the captured men were transported to Norfolk, Virginia, a historic naval hub that became the stage for a rare modern piracy trial. American law provided a framework for such cases, drawing from centuries of precedent that defined piracy as a universal crime. The evidence gathered from the SY quest was overwhelming. Weapons recovered from the yacht, recorded communications, and the testimony of Navy personnel painted a clear picture of premeditated violence. The pirates were not poor fishermen caught in desperation, but armed raiders who had traveled hundreds of miles to seize innocent lives for ransom. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate choice to fire an RPG at a U.S. warship, an act that underscored their willingness to escalate violence. The trial revealed the harsh reality that piracy in the modern era was not simply theft, but a brutal form of maritime terrorism. In 2013, after lengthy proceedings, 3 of the captured pirates were sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of release. Others received decades-long sentences, ensuring that none of those responsible would return to the waters to threaten another vessel. The verdicts carried symbolic weight, demonstrating that acts of piracy against American citizens would not fade into obscurity, but would be punished with the full force of law. Yet even as justice was rendered in court, the memory of the 4 slain sailors remained a scar on the Navy and a reminder of the limits of military might. The presence of one of the most powerful fleets in the world had not been enough to prevent the killings. The legal outcome brought accountability, but it could not erase the sense of failure felt by those who had tried to intervene. The story of the SY quest became more than a case of piracy. It became a precedent for how nations would respond to hostage crises on the high seas. It revealed that overwhelming firepower could surround a threat, but could not always protect the innocent caught within it. The battle had ended, the court had ruled, but the shadow of that tragedy continued to shape the way maritime powers viewed the dangers of piracy in the 21st century. The hijacking of the SY quest and the deaths of 4 American citizens stand as one of the darkest chapters in the modern history of piracy. The United States Navy assembled one of the most powerful maritime task forces in existence, led by the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise and supported by cruisers, destroyers, helicopters, and special operations teams. The ocean was filled with steel, firepower, and advanced technology, yet none of it could alter the reality that 19 pirates armed with rifles and a single rocket launcher controlled the fate of 4 civilians on a fragile sailing yacht. The tragedy revealed that power at sea does not always translate into control. Naval dominance can surround, intercept, and pressure, but once hostages are in the hands of men willing to kill, the strongest fleet on Earth is forced into a cruel race against time. The immediate consequences of the operation were felt in the courtroom as well as on the sea. 13 pirates were captured and brought to the United States to face justice. The trials in Norfolk, Virginia were unprecedented in scale and severity. Prosecutors presented evidence that demonstrated the deliberate violence of the hijacking. The attack on a U.S. warship with an RPG was shown as proof that the pirates were not simply desperate opportunists, but combatants willing to escalate to acts of war. In 2013, 3 pirates received life sentences without the possibility of release, while others were condemned to decades behind bars. These judgments sent a message to the world that piracy against American citizens would bring not only immediate military response, but also permanent legal consequences. Yet legal justice did not erase the sense of loss. For the families of Gene and Scott Adam, Phyllis McKay, and Robert Riggle, the trial was a confirmation of guilt, but never a replacement for the lives stolen. For the sailors of the USS Sterett and the rest of the strike group, the memory of that night remained a heavy weight. They had fought with courage and precision. They had risked their lives to storm the yacht, and they had succeeded in eliminating or capturing the threat. But they had not succeeded in saving the people they had come to protect. It was a reminder that military power, no matter how overwhelming, carries limits that technology and training cannot always overcome. Strategically, the SY Quest case forced naval planners and international coalitions to reconsider how to counter piracy before it reached the point of hostage crises. Escort operations, expanded intelligence networks, and multinational patrols became more central in the years that followed. The lesson was simple but harsh. Prevention is more effective than reaction. Once civilians are in captivity, the options narrow, and every decision carries the risk of bloodshed. The tragedy also revealed the adaptability of pirate groups. Even under intense pressure from global navies, they extended their operations far from the Somali coast, using hijacked motherships to push hundreds of miles into the Arabian Sea. Piracy was not a relic of the past, but a living threat capable of evolving with circumstances. The legacy of the SY quest is therefore twofold. It is a story of courage under impossible conditions and of justice served after brutal crimes. It is also a warning about the fragility of safety on the open ocean. The vastness of the sea hides dangers that even the most powerful fleets cannot always predict or prevent. Naval dominance remains vital, but it cannot guarantee the lives of every sailor, every traveler, or every missionary who sets sail. The tragedy of February 2011 was more than a single event. It was a mirror held up to the world, showing that in the 21st century, the line between freedom and danger at sea is still thin and sharp as a blade. If you believe stories like this matter and that we must understand modern war before it happens again, subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel.